So, last time was a little different. While this video is meant to stand on its own, it serves as a soft follow-up to my hour-long video essay linking some, but certainly not all, of the references that Toby Fox has made in his games towards his monolithic unreleased song Penumbra Phantasm. That video served as a jumping-off point for what Penumbra serves as musically during the Undertale Deltarune series, but eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed that I nodded at, but never fully delved into what I think that Penumbra's actual piece in the story could be.
If Penumbra doesn't end up being Gaster's boss theme, then I can only think of one other place it might be appropriate.
While I share little ground with Gaster deniers, I do have to admit that as of Chapter 2, there's not quite enough evidence to solidly link Penumbra Phantasm to Gaster's theme. And that's not for a lack of trying, nor is it an accident. There are very few times in it where I went purely into speculative territory, and that's because the purpose of that video was meant to be first and foremost informational. This one, though, is the last stretch of a marathon. I've been pacing myself for 2 years at this point. Now, it's time to enjoy myself before collapsing past the finish line. Deltarune Textual is a game that is full of references to water. The structures that control the ebb and flow of a dark world's influence are fountains, a sheer force of magical darkness spewing like a geyser out of a crack in the ground. So far, it seems that any lightener can make one with seemingly any sharp enough object, enough purposeful intent, and, of course, enough determination. Kris changes whenever they enter the Dark World, far more drastically than any of the other Delta Warriors. Or Heroes of Light, if you prefer, or the Fun Gang, or the While Susie's sprites become more saturated in the Dark World, both serving as a good visual contrast for her in the opening segments, and giving her a more cohesive color palette, Kris's skin tone jumps a third of the way around the color wheel. Specifically to the hex code 75F bed, a visually appealing shade of blue-green, usually described in words like turquoise or aqua. This isn't concerning on its own, but there are a few striking details that raise my suspicions, and many other theorists before me. Undertale made a point of describing humans as being mostly made out of water. This is observably true in our real world, yes, but in that game, it was meant to serve as a contrast to monsters' bodies and diets being primarily made out of magic. In a relog to the original Ocean Theory Tumblr post, Agent Ravensong points out that, quote,
"Our friend Kris turns pale blue in the Dark Worlds. If they look at themselves through the shadow crystal, they briefly find their hand to be transparent. Perhaps there's something concerning here."
The Dark World isn't the only place where Kris exhibits concerning parallels to drowning. Susie teases them in Chapter 2 by calling them the school zombie, even pointing out that they'd been sleeping like a corpse. Alphys shows similar concern before reasoning that they'd probably just been antsy about the town's internet going out. But perhaps, even more concerningly, as pointed out by Half-Bred Chaos in their video Goner Code, which you should go watch, there's a lot of messages that have to do with danger, death, and deficiency when you try to break the game and access areas you shouldn't.
Suddenly, your body seizes up. Your eyesight became blurry. Your heartbeat quickened. It could not be.
And, of course, the key information that trumps above it all. Right after we see Susie and Kris fall into the Dark World for the very first time, there's this little snippet of audio that plays just before we see Kris's prone body. An audio track that I can never help but always mentally compare to the different times we hear wind during the series. In Queen's Mansion, by Onion Son's little spot by the lake, in the dead world we ourselves were responsible for destroying in Undertale. But the most obvious parallel that I somehow always end up glossing over The time where we see Frisk falling into the garbage receptacle in Waterfall. That snippet of audio that plays right before our very first adventure into the Dark World is called Ocean.ogg. Susie, Birdly, and Noelle are given more color, more life in the Dark World. Susie transitions from a Dark Knight into a healing master. Birdly becomes a Super Saiyan, I guess. And don't even get me started on Noelle, who is depicted as an angel. Meanwhile, Kris gets cyanosis. Either they've got an extreme case of Raynaud's disease, or something more magical and or metaphorical is afoot here. I don't believe that we should be using sprite names and the code on its own for theory crafting, especially for anything that goes unused, but when paired with the knowledge of in-game events, they can be useful for stringing things together. Therefore, we have an interesting dichotomy here. While it makes sense to peer into the game data for many reasons, but first and foremost because part of it literally cries out to us for help, we should be responsible before using it to hold up any of our theories. To prop Undertale up again as an example, despite River Person's name being listed as Riverman in the files, they literally state in-game that both their name and gender doesn't really matter. Their name and their identity is River Person. Do not misgender them. Pretty easy stuff. This rhetoric should be kept in mind when it comes to stating any kind of fact about these games. After all, even without knowing that the name of the Goner Maker soundtrack in the opening of Deltrune is Another Hymn, we'd already be able to use common sense to point to its connection with Gaster's theme, as opposed to Asriel Dreamer's. Even though Azzy's theme is called his theme, it's clear that the him in question here is someone we have a different kind of history with. As fun as a theory of Asriel secretly being this puppet master like in the last game might be, that would be blatantly ignoring every single moment that Deltarune uses to point out and establish that Azzy isn't here because he's pursuing a higher education. That they have such similar names is just a more obvious nod towards what this song is intended to do. In this case, reminding us of a certain former royal scientist. That being said, in the same bit of dialogue where Jevil foreshadows Queen, he says that Hell's roar bubbles from the depths. Bubbles, obviously, are something that rise from lower parts of water, and what is this asset from the vessel creation section called? This same asset that is reused for the Dark Fountains is either the same image as or is weirdly similar to the chilling effect used right before Papyrus's fight in Undertale, and originally comes from an image of the ocean. Well, in the files, it's called image_depth. The connections ripple out from here. Ralsei's cloak looks suspiciously similar to River Person's. Literally everything going on with Clam Girl, and two of the most involved community members in the light world being turtles. Ralsei's largest section with Kris in Chapter 2 is on an acid lake, which probably is a coincidence. And that's not even mentioning the more speculative sides of what this could mean in a literary sense. If the goal of this game is to banish heaven and revolves around a dissonance between light and dark, does that mean the dark world is meant to be hell? If darkness is water, are we meant to be submerged in darkness? Is water hell? 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 When I was little, I almost drowned and died. My relationship with water and being in it or near it immediately and irrevocably changed. I stopped joining swim teams and made up any excuse I could not to go into a pool for years after. But curiously, the thing that affected me the most were depictions of being underwater in media. I all but dropped Genshin Impact as soon as Fontaine came out, despite how much I would come to love the characters from the region. Watching the first opening of Jujutsu Kaisen is still a little uncomfortable to me, even if I adore what that imagery means for Yuji. Despite how short this script is, even having to make the mental connection that Kris might be a metaphorical depiction of drowning was so uncomfortable that despite knowing I needed to knock this script out, it still took me weeks to finally sit down and type it. When we become exposed to something dangerous, our minds immediately associate that thing with a threat, and try to do everything in its power to make us get away from it. If we can't do that, it makes up for it in other ways. Susie clearly struggles with authority figures, and her behavior around Toriel alone is more than enough to suggest that she doesn't have a happy home life. Noelle is the perfect girl next door, the baby of the family, one who's been desperately searching for her missing sister, to the point where she regularly looks up the name December Holiday online and combs through her spam folder just for the smallest chance of being able to find her. She associates her mother with coldness, literally freezing up near an air conditioner and immediately backing down and agreeing to follow directions when receiving pushback. This is a trauma response. Something is going on in the Holiday household, and whatever it is, I am not looking forward to seeing it. I wonder what exactly associates Kris so strongly with water. I wonder what Kris is trying to get away from. Okay, I don't know if onion should be on that list of things to get away from, but I'm keeping an eye on them either way. But while we're here, why don't we talk to our new friend? Oh. Okay. I cannot impress on you how fucking bonkers it felt to read this for the first time back when Chapter 2 had dropped. This dialogue right here that Onion's saying, this Song of the Sea, that's a reference to something you have a chance to see whenever you take River Person's ferry. River Person's an interesting character to me. In a game chock full of non-binary characters, they're one of the most blatant examples of this. Who are they? Doesn't matter one bit. You want to get on the boat or not, buddy? Sometimes they've got a normal boat, and sometimes it's turning into a dog and running on top of the water. Hey, what the fuck did you just say? A lot of River Person's dialogue consists of cute, cryptic jabbering about secrets you may or may not have missed during your time in the underground. You may have not known about Sans' lab during your first playthrough, but they sure did. And apparently, one of the things that they knew about was this. Foreshadowing is a literary device. No, seriously, this is cool. This was such a fun thing to spot and experience, and it's one of the better ways to make a reference in a video game. It's simultaneously an intriguing thing for players new to Toby Fox games, and a reward for people who remember this interaction from Undertale. It doesn't overstay its welcome, and most importantly, it doesn't alienate players who don't know this is a reference. I've got a lot of thoughts about the slippery slope of just how obnoxious this kind of thing can get, but let's save that for another video, shall we? Where'd you go? You were just staring off into space for a minute there. Are you good? Maybe you should take a sip of water. But what is this Song of the Sea? I could sit here and recite from memory everything I know about every other reference the Undertale Deltarune series makes to water, about the significance of the waterfall area, maybe pull out a paragraph or three about Garrison and whatever the heck is going on with Shiren, but the truth of the matter is, we don't know. And I'm not really interested in the whole business of speculating what. Chapter 3 and 4 are supposed to be dropping in the next quarter, and sometimes I think it's more fun to just let a good mystery sit and marinate until we've got more clues to ruminate on. Chapter 2 was released over 3 years ago now, and we're getting to the point where everything there is to say in technical terms about what can happen has already been said, and very well. If and when I ever make a dedicated Deltarune video essay again, I'd rather the focus be on gathering information, gathering data, really diving into the emotional responses rather than the secret narrative of Azipants and why that proves Papyrus is the knight. Which does sound like fun videos to watch, and I bear no ill will to the kind of person who can do it, but it sounds like hell to make, and I'm not the kind of guy who can really put my heart into it. But don't let me stop you from doing what you love. I'm not your dad. I know I'll get to you someday. Go back to trying to figure out Toby Fox's Blue Sky password. To me, the Song of the Sea is simply a series of puzzle pieces inside of Deltarune's larger jigsaw metaphor that we just don't have enough information at this time to start piecing together. Sure, maybe that's a little disappointing, but sometimes we just don't have a neat way to tie everything back into each other. Sometimes you just have to let things be. But I'll leave you with this to ponder. In one of the earliest versions of Penumbra Phantasm, which, again, if you don't know why that's important or its significance to this series, I've got an hour-long documentary all about it, we can hear a lot of the instruments that Toby would and did use for other Homestuck tracks, introduced alongside Gentle Waves. It's a penumbra that very comfortably sits nestled beside its child, savior of the waking world. And there's something so melancholic about listening to it now. Like a piece of itself broke apart and got nice and comfortable, letting time go on without it. We can recognize the beginnings of parts that Toby would revisit and expand upon inside of it. But there's this one bit, just this one part, that stayed only in this version. Something that was left behind. At the end of this penumbra, as the instruments twinkle and the backing fades away, you can feel the winds blowing, the waves shifting. I think maybe I've heard that song before, coming from the sea. The whole thing. It's not a new song, but I can't remember. I can't remember, you hear? I'm going to investigate, you hear? I don't know if this is all coincidence, or if it was perfectly planned, or if it's just a cruel irony at the end of it all. But at the end of this penumbra, it has one last clap before it all fades away into the ocean. And that's it. That's all he wrote. I'm recording this only a few hours after my first Penumbra video dropped, and I have no idea what the reception of that video is going to be. Is it going to blow up? Is it going to stay at maybe 200 views max? Who fucking knows? And of course I care about how people are going to see it, how people are going to view it, but the most important thing is that it's fucking done. It's out, and it's done, and I never have to sit and edit that video again.